We now continue with Smurf.
The following information is now almost impossible to find due to media blackouts and censorship efforts launched by the British government. I am able to relay it purely because I had taken copious notes in a loose-leaf notebook and was prepared to flee my residence within minutes of deeming it necessary. The events described below have been heavily investigated by members of an online community that is no longer in existence and have been confirmed by multiple sources. In most instances, the sources of the information were postings on social media websites. These postings rarely stayed up for more than an hour, and after the first day of the event, were likely being removed automatically by programs presumably set up by the government. In cases where the source was different, I have specified its origin. Numerous details surrounding the story have been left out due to a lack of multiple sources. On July 27, 2014, at around 11 AM, a large portion of the Cairngorms National Park in Scotland was cordoned off by the British military. The consensus is that the epicenter of this containment effort was a small patch of forest 2.3 miles southwest of Benvrec Mountain. The first sign that this was taking place was when a man walking his dogs through the park saw a military transport helicopter flying above the tree canopy. 15 minutes later, a couple out for a hike spotted British soldiers moving through a patch of forest some distance away from them. They described the troops as fast-moving, heavily armed, and with their faces concealed. The soldiers did not notice the couple and appeared focused on the woods. Around 11:30 AM, British soldiers began actively and aggressively removing people from the park. The removal efforts were well outside of the epicenter of containment, suggesting that the British military was evacuating as many people from the park as possible. Soldiers driving battery-powered all-terrain vehicles, silent except for the sound of their tires rolling over the forest floor, picked up any civilians that they saw. The civilians were then driven out of the park. The soldiers explained nothing, except that a training mission was in progress and that they were being evacuated for their safety. Civilians being driven out said the soldiers, clutching their weapons and staring into the forest, looked unusually guarded for a training mission. The reason for the containment, as it is now known with a considerable degree of certainty, was the presence of a humanoid entity within the forest. The first civilian sighting of this entity was made by a woman who had been bird watching with a land telescope from the face of the Ben Avon mountain. She saw a transport helicopter land in a field a mile or two from the base of the mountain, then saw troops get out of the helicopter and move to the forest. Later, the woman was scanning the tree lines of the surrounding forest when she, by chance, spotted what she described as a naked, pale-skinned person. The person moved bizarrely, with a kind of over-exaggerated upright posture and with very slow and smooth body movements. Specific details of the entity's physical appearance were impossible to make out due to the distance. She reported that the thing eventually disappeared into the woods. The second sighting was on the bank of a small river called the Derry Burn. Two older men were walking to a fishing spot when they spotted a red-faced thing in the woods on the other side of the river. They said it looked like a person with white skin wearing a mask made of red jade. The thing was staring at the bark of a tree, perfectly still, and with childlike curiosity. The men watched it for some time, keeping as quiet as possible. At some point, the entity became aware of them. It rotated its head towards them in a manner that unsettled the two men. They described it as like a head on a rotating plate, all the while keeping its body still. For the brief few seconds the men were staring face to face with the entity, both remarked that as soon as the entity looked at them, they were overwhelmed by the stench of burning plastic. They quickly dropped their fishing equipment and ran away. These men did not describe their encounter on social media. Rather, they went to a bar they frequented and told it to the bartender there, who then posted the story in the miscellaneous forum of bodybuilding.com in a thread that grew to 8 pages in 20 hours. Like I said earlier, there was a group investigating all of this, but this group did not exist in the first few days, per se. There were people posting in threads on different forums, and there were curious people here and there digging up what they could, but none of them had come together yet and actually organized. One of the guys who eventually became a member of this group had a friend in the Royal Air Force. He had known this friend long before the park was locked down. This friend a few days after the lockdown took place, relayed him a story. The friend and his fellow Royal Air Force personnel were ordered, the same day the forest was locked down, to clear the runway they were stationed at, in order to host aircraft coming in from different bases. Military jets landed throughout the day to refuel, with no markings indicating their base of origin. The pilots flying them were described by airbase personnel as cold and untalkative, and they rarely left their cockpits. The purpose of these aircraft became apparent in the evening, when the Royal Air Force began bombing areas of the park. The bombings were not acknowledged by the government and were not reported by any media source. I know I sound crazy claiming this. Much of the information on the bombings comes from a thread on jeepforum.com, strangely enough. Off-road enthusiasts with jeeps had been in the area when everything started. These folks had encountered British troops earlier in the day and were told to leave the area immediately, which they did. However, they stuck around near the edge of the park, hoping to witness something exciting. They saw nothing, but at around 7 p.m., they heard what sounded like a deep clap of thunder off in the distance. There were no clouds in the sky, so they thought the sound was suspicious. They drove to higher grounds in hopes of seeing something, but saw only a hint of light smoke drifting over the trees far away. Nothing could be seen definitively due to the distance. A series of explosions were then heard at around 7:20 p.m. An American tourist staying at a bed and breakfast in Kincraig, northwest of the epicenter, had been hiking along B970 when he heard it. It came from far off in the park. He described it as a series of rapid explosions. This same series of explosions was heard by a teenager who had been chopping wood in his backyard nearby. A few civilians contacted the authorities to find out if they had any information on the noises. They were told by police that what they heard was probably a mining excavation or a thunderstorm over the mountain. This despite everyone having reported cloudless skies throughout the day. Further calls to the authorities on the subject were ignored, and the media made no effort to investigate the explosions. If this seems unlikely, remember that the British government is more than capable of orchestrating media blackouts, and has done so for things far more insignificant. The UK is also one of the most CCTV-watched countries on Earth, with one camera for every 11 people. The police can arrest you for appearing in public with someone they told you not to. The people in charge of the country are more than capable of suppressing information. Still, for the first few days, most of the internet communities discussing the event were safe, except for those on major social media websites. The day after all of this happened, a no-fly zone was issued over the park. This declaration was not made public. It was only noticed when someone on jeepforum.com investigated the area using flightradar24.com and saw no flights coming within 10 miles of the place. One of the members on the forum called the Department for Transport and asked if a no-fly zone had been issued. He was smart enough to do this from a payphone, and with a subtle disguise on that would make identifying him on CCTV difficult. Upon mentioning the park and the no-fly zone, he was politely asked to remain on hold. He put the phone down, off the hook, and walked about a block away to observe the phone booth from a safe distance. His suspicions were vindicated a few minutes later, when two black unmarked cars pulled up to the payphone. He said intimidating-looking men, not wearing anything that would identify them as law enforcement, exited the vehicles and began approaching the payphone. He fled as soon as he saw them. We assume that whatever happened could embarrass the British government if it was made public, but it wasn't so serious that we were in danger of talking about it. The spotting of the red-faced person had been known to us, but we did not take them seriously during the first few days. We all just assumed the whole thing was some political bullshit. Then, certain eyewitnesses to the events were quietly arrested. One or two of the arrests were described in local news sources, but for the most part, the arrests were inferred based on happenings on social media. In the few instances where the arrest was discussed in the news, it was stated that the individual was arrested for either possession of drugs or for committing undisclosed white-collar crimes. Profiles on sites such as Facebook and Twitter were also being deleted, not just of the folks arrested, but of their family members. Many of the arrests seem strange given the nature of the people arrested. People, for example, were being arrested for large-scale drug possession, despite a history of absolutely no drug use, according to their friends and family. Then the threads on jeepforum.com and bodybuilding.com both disappeared. Anyone attempting to revive the discussions was banned. Some of the major folks involved in the discussion managed to get in touch with each other, using email addresses that could be found on archived copies of the forums. With the help of a tech-savvy member, we eventually established a low-key, private forum to talk about what happened. Things were quiet for the next few months. We tried to work out what happened and find evidence supporting all the claims made. It was exciting, you know? One member of this community had a large, real-life social network and was trying to find anyone who might have information on what happened. Somehow, he said it was through an acquaintance in a government office he was put in contact with someone. The contact was out of the country and refused to reveal his location. The only communication he had with this individual was in the form of a single long email that was sent from a cryptic email address. The story told in the email was far more bizarre than anything heard yet. However, it included explanations for many of the things observed, and minor aspects of the story were confirmed by our own research. The majority of the members of our group, after much internal debate, came to accept the story as true. This anonymous contract, who used the alias Brown, claimed that the military lockdown at Cairngorms National Park was due to an emergency in a clandestine underground laboratory. Brown was a member of a two-man response team sent by the military to investigate the emergency. Brown thought it was strange that only 2 men would be sent to investigate, and came up with, as he was being driven to the lab, 2 reasons why the military would do this. One was that the military knew that there were no threats within the lab and simply wanted to scout it with a small team. The other was that the military knew there was a major threat in the lab and saw these 2 men as disposable. Upon entering the facility, he assumed a third option, that only 2 men were sent because the military planned on killing them afterwards to keep the lab a secret. Brown described the lab as sleek and high-tech, with shiny blue-gray tiles covering the walls and floors. Most of the desks they encountered housed state-of-the-art computer technology. He said it looked like it was from 50 years in the future. The team was told to recover hard drives, files, and notebooks containing information on Project Centaur. The nature of the project was not explained. They were given a map that highlighted offices and labs worth investigating. They were also told to approach the lower levels of the lab with caution and assess the status of certain test subjects located there. The facility had been constructed such that wireless communication was impossible from within, so the men had to periodically check in by using hard lines accessible from communication rooms. This gave them the freedom to explore and discuss what they were seeing without anyone eavesdropping. The men were not greeted by anyone. The security room near the entrance was empty. They went in and found a lunchroom where a sandwich sat half-eaten on the table. As they moved into the facility, they saw that the entire place was flashing red under the light of a silent emergency alarm. They encountered a body in an office off of the main hall. It was a lady in a chair who looked like a mannequin. Her legs were locked out as if the knee joints had been fused together. Her eyes were wide and looked leathery, like they had been boiled. Her face and lips were bright pink and appeared chemical burnt. The rest of her skin was a waxy gray and was charred in certain parts. Her veins had turned black and were easily visible underneath the skin. They noticed that she was still breathing. The topic of mercy killing her came up, but it was decided against after realizing that whatever did this to her might come back and find her with a bullet wound and thus be alerted to the 2 men's presence. Brown said that in retrospect, it was weird that they both assumed some sort of thing had done it, rather than, say, chemical exposure or radiation. For some reason, both men had assumed from the start that some kind of hostile thing was responsible for the lab state. As they explored further, they found dozens of bodies in a similar state. Some were breathing lightly, but many were dead. Some of the bodies had disfiguring burn marks on their face, like they had been burned with a clothes iron. On 2 occasions, they found a body that looked like it had been burned completely into still ash all the way through, like a spent log in a fireplace. The 2 men headed deeper into the facility, collecting notebooks from offices and hard drives from computers. In the deepest layers of the facility, they found the test subjects they had been warned about. They were inside observation rooms, visible through thick glass windows. They were alive. Their faces were expressionless and black except for their noses, which were red. Their eyes looked sealed shut. They were shambling around like animals that had just been hit by a car. At this point, Brown and his co-worker abandoned all pretenses of professional coolness and began discussing freely what they were saying. Both agreed that the government had crossed some kind of ethical line. They decided to read over the notebooks they had collected so far to try and figure out what had happened. They looked over the files they had taken. They only learned general information on Project Centaur, that it involved splicing human DNA with segments of artificial DNA that contained unnatural base pairs. Base pairs are what make up DNA. The two men decided that the main lab, at the deepest point of the facility, would likely contain more information. They made their way to the depths of the underground structure, where they found a large biomedical laboratory. As they explored the lab, they came across two vats, large enough to fit a standing person. Both vats were open. One had been fractured open, with glass shards sprawled on the floor in the front, while the other had its lid ripped off and thrown across the lab. They found no dead scientists. The floor, however, was covered in burn marks, and in certain parts melted, and one of the burn marks vaguely resembled the outline of a person. Additionally, both men noticed the lab was filled with the smell of burnt plastic. They gathered up notebooks from the laboratory. These contained far more detailed information on what had happened. In particular, a document resembling a grant proposal provided a solid backstory. With the information they had, they were able to piece together the origins of the research being done. It began with a financial analyst working for the Bank of England, who started without any apparent reason to have hallucinogenic visions of a recurring pattern. He saw the pattern visually. It resembled what a person sees if they press on their closed eyes. He was experienced in mathematics and saw the details of these visions with unnatural clarity, and so was able to take these visions and express them numerically. He noticed that the patterns were composed of 4 repeating values, which, on a hunch, he believed correlated to the 2 base pairs of human DNA. When he compared this pattern to the human DNA sequence, he found that it matched certain key segments of the human genome, only slightly altered. His visions, in summary, were of altered fragments of human DNA. The results floored him. He began to analyze further. He found that when he incorporated the fragments into a complete genome using generic human DNA from the Human Genome Project, the result was 98.7% human. Chimpanzee DNA, for reference, is about 98% human. This genome, however, was not closer to chimpanzees. It was more distant. It was, if you will excuse me for saying, different in the other direction. His visionary genome, in certain instances, contained base pairs that were not one of the 2 that exist in nature. They were unnatural base pairs. Unnatural base pairs had been synthesized in laboratories, but obviously never found in nature. His vision gave no indication as to which base pair was required, but he was convinced that God had contacted him and had given him the recipe for perfecting mankind. Finding the right combination, therefore, was inevitable. He approached biologists from different universities, professors working in the field of synthetic biology, and spared them nothing of his theories. At this point, he believed himself a prophet and assumed that any who heard him would instantly agree. One of the professors contacted the authorities immediately after the man dropped by and left his office. He assumed he was mentally insane. The financial analyst was taken into police custody. Eventually, he was subject to medical testing, where doctors found numerous small tumors in his occipital lobe. His employment at the Bank of England was terminated, and he was supposedly transported to a 24/7 medical facility to receive specialized care. The man's fate is unknown. The government, for whatever reason, began to research his work. Apparently, they were as dumbfounded at the whole situation as anyone would be. They planned to introduce the described alterations into human DNA and observe what effects it had. Altering human DNA was, according to these documents, easy. Scientists could engineer a series of viruses to deliver the altered DNA to every cell in the human body. The only difficulty was deciding which unnatural base pairs to include. The government researchers had no leads, so they simply began trying different unnatural base pairs, hoping that one would eventually work. They decided to test these viruses in living human subjects. The first few tests were catastrophic. Subjects who were injected with the cocktail began to suffer extreme reactions to the DNA-altering infection. Their bodies seemed to fall apart. Skin blistered and sloughed off. Lymphatic fluid leaked from every square inch of skin. Organs failed in tandem. The initial test subjects all died within an hour of being injected. As the researchers experimented with different unnatural base pairs, they found formulations that kept subjects alive for longer. The subjects spotted in the observation room were created as a result of these formulations. In the most recent tests, the human subjects showed new changes. They suffered far less during the infection when compared to previous tests, and were described as having red faces, rather than black ones, as the previous subjects had. These were the test subjects that were missing from the person-sized vats. These two red-faced subjects were being grown or altered or whatever when the emergency happened. That was the last bit of information the two men were able to extract from the notebooks recovered in the lab. Curiously, one of the lab notebooks appeared to have had its last pages ripped out. With their mission complete, the two men headed out and to the surface. The military took them into their possession, along with the materials they had found. The two men were separated. Brown was subject to a hostile interrogation. He said that he remained calm and disinterested throughout it, hoping that his interrogators would assume he was unaffected and uninterested in what he had seen. The interrogation process lasted nearly a day. Afterwards, Brown was moved to a high-security military base. He was not put in a jail cell, but he was blocked with communicating with anyone outside, and his movements around the base were restricted. Fortunately for Brown, someone at the base was familiar to him. It was a friend with whom he had served in Afghanistan. More importantly, Brown had saved his friend's life in Afghanistan. He called in the favor, and the friend obliged him by smuggling him out of the building during the night. Brown fled the British Isles and then the Western world in general. When the story was relayed to our forum, no one believed it. Still, we did not have much to keep ourselves busy with, so a handful of members took to investigating certain facts. The original email gave the actual name of the financial analyst from the Bank of England, the one who had the visions. It was decided that, as a good starting place, we would try and track down this individual and confirm his existence. Typing his name into a search engine yielded nothing noteworthy, so we got creative. It was assumed that since he was working at a prestigious financial institution, he likely was a talented student and had probably attended a high-ranking secondary school and university. If his existence had been wiped from the internet, which most of us assumed was the case, we could still contact someone he had gone to school with and get confirmation from them. A list of potential schools was drawn up. We decided to look at secondary schools, since it's far too easy for someone to attend a university without being known to the wider student body. Secondary schools, on the other hand, almost everyone is at least somewhat aware of everyone else's existence. People began calling secondary schools on our shortlist. After a number of unsuccessful calls, someone called a day trader who had attended Warwick School and had a reputation for a talent in math. The day trader's voice lit up at the very mention of the financial analyst's name. They had indeed gone to school together, he confirmed, and the analyst had been a prodigious student with high accolades. The person who made the call considered it a success. Before he could end the call, though, the day trader said something else. He had been contacted by the police a few weeks ago. The police warned the day trader that someone may call in the future and ask about the financial analyst, and that if anyone does, he must deny having known him, and then contact the police immediately. This was a major breakthrough. It confirmed the police were trying to suppress the knowledge of the financial analyst, and thus gave some weight to the ridiculous story of the underground lab. At this point, Most of us had accepted Brown's story as accurate. Earlier, I mentioned that I was only going to describe the events that have been verified by reliable sources. I feel that at least mentioning some of the unverified claims is necessary. They have been discussed and debated and researched heavily on a forum, and even though their credibility had not been proven, the simple fact that people were whispering them on our forum affected all of our perception of the event. Two stories in particular were considered nearly proven. The first one came from a man who had been biking through Cairngorms Park the day the event took place. There are a number of facts that give his story credibility, but it had its doubters due to the nature by which it was known. It was relayed to us by an otherwise trusted member of a forum, who said he read it on a post on the Jeep forums on the day that everything happened. Unfortunately, he had not taken any screen caps of the original post, and no evidence could be found in any archives. We had nothing but his word, which was enough for many but not for all. The story is this. The biker claimed that as he was traveling down a trail, he was hit with the stench of burning plastic. He thought there was a fire somewhere, so he got off of his bike and looked around. Eventually, he heard some rustling in the woods nearby. As he walked towards the source of the noise, he saw what he described as a group of deer lying on the forest floor, with their internal anatomy rearranged to make them bipedal. The deer, however, still seemingly had brains wired for quadrupedal motion, and thus could only flail around on the ground. The biker ran back to his bike as soon as he saw the deer, and pedaled off. He had not brought his phone or any kind of camera with him, and so could not take pictures of what he had seen. This story almost definitely would have been considered true, were it not for the fact that it was so unsubstantiated. The next story came from a man claiming to have been one of the soldiers who had evacuated the park. Not at all unbelievable, as there were a decent number of troops in the forest on that day, and it was likely some of them had loose lips. This man, however, made claims that had not been made anywhere else. Many in our group believed the story was made up. We were nearly split over it, and we killed many hours discussing it. I personally believe it is true. The soldier claimed he was with 4 others, doing routine sweeps for civilians, when they spotted the test subject at the edge of a forest. The soldiers themselves were moving across a large grass field. The test subject was a few hundred yards away, and not facing them. It was looking at their 10 o'clock, with its back facing them at an angle. As they approached it, the subject turned its head and looked at them. Like in the story of the 2 old fishermen, the soldier claimed that as soon as it looked at them, they were overcome with the taste and stench of burning plastic. He described it as a person wearing a mask of red gemstone, with a sickly pale body that was almost see-through. The soldier was hit with a wave of intense fear, but forced himself to raise his weapon and approach the thing. They approached it slowly, without firing their weapons. After about 50 yards, the thing turned its body towards them and started walking. As soon as that happened, all 5 men stopped without a word. The soldier claimed that he was overcome with the understanding that he was not to move under any circumstances. He said it was like a freeze reflex, but totally unbreakable. He had been hit with a strange conviction that he would be safe as long as he did not move. The thing continued to approach them. When it was within 100 yards, the soldier could see the details of its mask-like face. Their eyes were closed, as was the mouth. The soldier said that at this point, he began to feel hotter, as if he were blushing and standing in front of an oven at the same time. Soon, he felt like red-hot wires were being threaded through his skin. The soldier was overcome with the knowledge that he would be safe, despite the heat, as long as he did not move. He was convinced the damage was reversible, and that the way to reverse it was to not move. In retrospect, he realized that this was ridiculous, and that the heat was damaging his skin, and they all had burn marks after the encounter. The only reason he and his companions were alive was that the test subject got distracted when some animal ran through the woods behind it. The soldier heard the rustling, and presumably so did the test subject. It turned its head in a bizarre manner, like it was floating above its body, to look for the source of the noise. As soon as the thing looked away, some of the soldier's freeze reflex lifted. It was still intense, but he was able to raise his weapon. His companions did likewise, and one of them fired off a round of bullets. The thing fled into the woods, dashing over 100 yards in what seemed like less than a second. The soldiers radioed in what had happened. They were then picked up and brought to a base. There they were told that they had been exposed to an experimental deliriant, which had caused their hallucinations, the burning on their skin, and the sensation of being frozen. The soldier initially believed his superiors, despite having a suspicion about the whole thing, but he realized he had been lied to when he heard other accounts of the red-faced test subject. There were other unconfirmed stories, but there was a good chance that they were simply made up. These two are the only things that people really thought might be truthful. 2 weeks ago, the forum that we had set up was shut down. As soon as I opened up the dead webpage, I grabbed my emergency bag and left my apartment. I have not gone back. Some of us more paranoid members had set up emergency communication plans we could use to stay in touch if something like this were to happen. I tried making a few calls and sending a few emails, but I got no response. I am trying to leave the British Isles. I plan to take a boat to continental Europe, then disappear in a former USSR country. I have no intention of continuing my involvement in this investigation. Good luck to anyone who wishes to continue where we left off. Hey, I hope you've enjoyed the stories. The goal for the channel is 100k, so please subscribe, like, and leave a comment because it really helps the channel. Thank you for watching.